Hello, everyone. We're delighted today to have Senator Claire Chandler. She's the Senator for Tasmania, member of the Liberal Party. Claire, how are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thank you, Sunil. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on. Always a good sort of starting base to start these sort of podcasts on is going through your general journey into politics, if you like. So I think we can start there.
Sure. So I joined the Liberal Students, which is our university campus-based youth organisation, the first week that I was studying at uni, which was 2009. It wasn't long after the Howard government had obviously lost in 2007, and I was getting a bit more politically interested as I came of voting age, and I thought I was pretty sure I was liberally minded. But the right thing to do if you want to really investigate these things is to get involved in politics and meet more like-minded people and sort of test your ideas that way. And that's certainly what the Liberal Students enabled me to have the opportunity to do. About 12 months after that, I joined the party proper right before the 2010 federal election, which the Liberals almost won. It resulted in a hung parliament with the Labor government in a power sharing arrangement. And so I guess that my political engagement was happening at a time where the Liberals were, going through the soul searching, doing the policy work required for when we would eventually end up in government again, which was in 2013. So that was sort of how I joined the party. Once I was in, I was pretty actively involved. I really caught the political bug. I loved being around people my age who had similar views on how the world works and how our country should work, and going to Liberal students conferences or young Liberals conferences really provided me with a great group of friends that I just wanted to keep coming back and seeing at conferences every year. So that really continued my interest for many years. And then I was had the honour of being the Tasmanian Young Liberal President when I was 25, and I was Federal Young Liberal President when I was 26. So I took leadership roles within the youth wing of the organisation as well. And from there, I guess you sort of get to a point where you're growing up a bit, starting to think about a political career, and it honestly wasn't something I ever turned my mind to. I thought, if I get the honour of doing that one day, it'll be something I do in my 40s, not something I do in my 20s, as was the case. But around the time that I was finishing up as Federal Young Liberal President, we as a party in Australia started concentrating on the struggles that we've had engaging with women. And I got involved in doing the review in Tasmania of how the Liberal Party engages with women, and surveying the membership and talking to women about why they haven't got more involved and all of this sort of stuff. And through that process, people said, well, we want more women to get involved in politics. You've done this, written a report that says this is what the Liberal Party needs to be doing better or differently. Why don't you put your hand up yourself? And I thought, oh, okay. And eventually enough people kept suggesting it that I thought it would be a good idea. So I ran in the state election in Tasmania, I should say, in Tassie in 2018, and wasn't successful then, but then ran for Senate pre-selection later that year, and was pre-selected number 2 on the Senate ticket for Tassie, and then entered the Parliament after the general election in 2019. And at that time, I was 29 years old. I was the youngest member of the government, the Liberal government, as it was at the time, and I was also the youngest woman in the Parliament. So, yeah, pretty incredible time to be doing it. And we need more young people to get involved in politics. But yeah, as is often the case with these things, it's not something that you sort of set out and plan. It just sort of happens.
What was that experience like, going into politics so young, and also being a female? I think in the UK, I think our Conservative Party's done reasonably well in the last few years, in particular, in attracting a lot of sort of female politicians. Obviously, we've had multiple female prime ministers here for the Conservative Party. But what was your experience like on both being so young and being a woman in that early stages of going through the whole process of getting elected?
I think there are always advantages and disadvantages to these things. And I think particularly being young, the advantage that you have is that you can clearly demonstrate the need to, for the party to reach out to younger generations and be part of that generational renewal, right? And that was another one of the reasons I put my hand up to run in the Senate in particular, is that there were a number of my, friends of mine who had ended up in the Senate and were about my age. And I thought, well, they're doing something incredibly important. We need to be able to articulate our values to young voters. It's more important now than ever that we do that, particularly in this age of social media. So it was, I hope to be able to be a part of that. So that was really positive. On the other hand, I think people are always very surprised that young people are involved in politics. Like, people say, oh, you're far too young to be a politician. And it can be, not demoralizing isn't the right word for it, but sometimes you think, oh, well, why shouldn't a young person get involved in politics? And now it's the situation where there's a woman from the Labor Party in the Senate who is, 5 or 6 years younger than me. So,
Right.
We are getting more young people involved. So that can only be a good thing, because we need to have that breadth of experience, whatever party you're in, whether it's a centre right party or a centre left party. And look, as a woman entering the parliament at that age, again, I think it was largely a very positive experience. I've been so fortunate in my time in politics and in my time in the Liberal Party to have been mentored by fantastic men and fantastic women who have all sort of helped me shape my path to where I got to. And so that's only continued since I've been in the parliament.
Amazing. And I think what'd be good to hear, what sort of attracted you to the Liberal Party going back younger? So what was it, the sort of the core values, the core principles, rationale that made you feel like a member, before we talk about being elected, just a general member of the Liberal Party?
Like I say, I joined the Liberal Party not long after the Liberals lost government in 2007, and Kevin Rudd became Prime Minister. And I just didn't, I thought that John Howard, as our Liberal Prime Minister, had done such a fantastic job of steering our country through, very good times and bad times. And he was just such a man of such strong character. And I didn't necessarily feel the same way about Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister. So I think that contrast point really was the catalyst for me signing up. But once I was there, I think, really the values of the individual and equality before the law and free speech in particular were motivating factors for me. I think it was hard 10 years ago when I was at university to be a conservative, a young woman on campus who was known for being conservative, because I was, involved in student politics and the like. But it's a lot harder than that now with, cancel culture and the way social media has sort of shaped our public debate about issues. So yeah, the free speech issue has always been a big motivator for me. And I think as it has, continually been eroded, is one of those issues that I just keep coming back to, whether it's, was when I was in the Young Liberals or Liberal Students or now.
I was going to touch on that in terms of being a young Conservative and being so, obviously being involved in politics and clearly being a vocal and Conservative, again, before you're elected. What was that experience like? And you mentioned there how you think it's got worse. I think most people would almost definitely agree with you. What have you seen that's made it clear to you that this situation is getting worse for, if you like, younger Conservatives, especially on campus at universities?
Yeah, when I was at university, it wasn't, I was never in a situation where I felt like I couldn't put my opinion on the record, right? But I'd be sitting in tutorials, and I did political science as part of my arts degree, and I did combine that with law. And I'd be sitting in political science tutorials, and I'd, give my point of view about, industrial relations or whatever the issue might have been. And other, students in the class would say, oh, but you're just a young Liberal, like as if to sort of denigrate my view just by virtue of my political affiliation. And that was I mean, not great, but the worst thing that I really had to deal with. But now I talk to Liberal students on campus, and they feel that they can't even engage in a debate or can't even put a point of view forward that's different to that which their lecturer or their tutor might have. And I just think, isn't the point of going to university, and it was certainly the approach that I took, that it's about challenging your ideas and figuring out how you see the world, and determining the value system that you are going to use for yourself to make a difference in the world. And you can't possibly develop that system of values and refine and figure out what you stand for if you're in an academic situation where you can't put any view on the record other than that which your lecturer has.
I think that,
so I think that the institutionally universities have got worse since I was there, but then you add in this extra layer of social media and engaging in debate, whether it's on Twitter mainly or Facebook, and just the insults that get thrown people's ways for the views that they have, or you can't say that, or that's not politically correct, or whatever. I just think it is incredibly hard, and you have to be incredibly brave to stand up for what you believe in these days.
I think a lot of people listening to this would definitely agree with your experience. We get a lot of people who email in saying similar sort of things, saying how it's so difficult on campus, and just being at university, or even end of school, just having these sort of anything non-left kind of view on anything can be quite frightening for a lot of sort of younger people. And talking about how it's sort of got worse, is there specific things you've seen outside of just social media? We'll definitely tackle social media, but outside of social media, because one things we see quite popular here in the UK, or something that's become quite big, is almost the divide between London and everywhere else in the UK. So being a conservative in London is very, like, it's very rare. You won't see too many people that will come out and say that they're conservative in a big city like London. Is that similar in Australia, where you have maybe Sydney as the kind of that big city where it's harder to be conservative, and the more rural parts, or going north and south from there, it's different? Or is that not so much the case there?
I haven't really thought about it. I mean, my experience is mainly in Tassie, and I don't think, being a young Liberal in Tassie, and I don't necessarily think it's harder to be a young Liberal in some geographies versus others. I think it's hard to be a member of a political party when your political party's in opposition, full stop, right? Like the brand is always going to be stronger, and people are always going to be far more excited about what you have to offer when you're in government. And we are now in a position in Australia where the Liberals are in opposition federally and in every state except Tasmania, where I'm speaking to you from right now. So that makes it tougher, I think. But again, we just have to remember that the values are timeless, and politics works in cycles, and we just have to stand up for what we believe in and provide a point of differentiation with the left of politics, and it'll the cycle will come back around again. I'm confident of that.
What is the general state of the Liberal Party at the moment? Because the thing in the UK, we don't get much Australian coverage of what's going on day to day. We tend to see obviously about the election that happened, and that's pretty much it. We don't get a feel of some of the issues or the core sort of stuff that's going on in Australia. So firstly, just in general, the Liberal Party, what's the sort of current state of it, and what's its sort of plans going forward?
Like I said, we're in opposition in every mainland state and territory, and we're in opposition federally. We are fortunately in government still in Tassie, and that obviously brings challenges. No one likes to be in opposition. You would always prefer to be in government, but that also provides you with the opportunity to very carefully scrutinise what Labor governments are doing across the country. And in terms of the hot button issues politically in Australia at the moment, cost of living is a big concern for families and for individuals as well, I think. We're seeing skyrocketing energy prices, inflation is on the rise, interest rates are on the rise, all of these sort of, big economic issues that we have to grapple with. And part of that was, particularly the inflation issue was as a result of the war in Ukraine and the supply chain issues that we all sort of, worldwide started to experience when that was the case. But there's also a question of whether or not the government is pulling the right levers to be able to manage those issues as they occur. And we've had a Labor government federally now for 12 months, and I don't think they've quite figured out what they're going to do about cost of living. We'll be looking very carefully at the budget that they hand down in May to see if they have some of the answers to those questions. But right now, they're falling pretty short on that. The other big issue in Australian politics at the moment, of course, is what we call the voice, or what the government is calling the voice, which is the question of constitutionally and enshrining a representative body to government for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. So we will be having a referendum at some point in the not too distant future. And the government was elected with a very strong mandate to do this, to put this question to the Australian people to say, well, we want to put a representative body into the Constitution. Unfortunately, the government has been very light on the details of what that body, that the voice we call it, is going to look like. And this week, the Liberal Party came to the position that we will not be supporting that. We'll be supporting the conduct of the referendum. We support Australians having their say, but we won't be supporting the concept of inserting this race-based body into the Constitution. So that will be taking up a lot of the commentary, and I think a lot of brain space for people between now and the end of the year. But at the same time, the struggle for the government is that we are also facing a cost of living crisis. So how are they going to balance, on the one hand, having this referendum about this issue that they have a mandate to do? I recognise that. But on the other, there are serious economic issues at play that they need to be able to handle.
So what's this body like? Is it similar to, like, I know in New Zealand, they have a Maori representative within their government. Is it a similar kind of thing that they're looking to do?
We don't know exactly what it's going to end up looking like. So the constitutional change that's proposed in the referendum will, in effect, just say that the body exists and that it advises, or it can be consulted by government, including executive government, when making decisions. And there is a lot of legal uncertainty around exactly what that consultation process is going to look like and what it means to be consulting to executive government in terms of, the relationship between the body and the cabinet, for example, or the body and government departments. So there is a fair bit of uncertainty out there around what this means. And I think that's one of the many reasons why the Liberals have sensibly come to not support this constitutional change.
It's interesting. I think the relationship Australia, New Zealand have with sort of native people, that's very interesting, because for here in the UK, this sort of stuff we'd all be saying it's sort of like, I don't know if it's like racial baiting, all that sort of stuff. It's very, I would say, not very popular again, other than maybe London and that sort of area. It's not something I think we'd really get much traction or talked about that much. So it's interesting always to hear the relationship New Zealand and Australia has with its native people, and how they sort of what they do from it.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, no Australian thinks that we shouldn't be doing more to make lives better for Indigenous Australians. There are some, Indigenous Australians living in remote communities dealing with very, very complex social issues, particularly domestic violence is the one that we are seeing on the news almost constantly at the moment out in these regional communities. And government should be doing everything that they can to be able to deal with those sorts of issues and provide support to those sorts of communities. But the concern that we as Liberals have is that the Labor government has not been able to set out how having a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament is actually going to make life better for Indigenous Australians in those communities. So it's, sort of like we all agree with the end goal, but how you get there is incredibly important. And I don't think the government's got it right on this one.
Right. And so Labour have been in power for 1 year, and how is
Just about.
just about okay? How's that 1 year being perceived? Because when the current prime minister was elected, there was we in the UK was covered, but there was stuff that I think the main sort of stuff we saw was that he was anti-monarchy and this sort of stuff in his previous stuff. So naturally, had probably more of a negative reaction here than positive. But summing up their 1 year, if you like, almost 1 year, what's that been like? You've mentioned the cost of living crisis. You've mentioned this bill. What else sort of changes, if anything else, they've brought to Australian people?
So I guess the big policy agenda item for them has been pursuing action on climate change in a far less careful and considered sort of way than what we were doing when we were in government, certainly. And I think this will ultimately end up sort of segueing into the cost of living issue. And the energy issue as well. Like we're in a situation where energy prices are going up, and we're talking about the need to get more green energy into the grid. And of course, we should all be doing our part to minimize the impacts of climate change and all of this sort of stuff. But the technology piece isn't necessarily there yet. So there is a real concern that the government is sort of pushing that change too quickly without having due consideration of, what are we going to do in the stopgap where we apparently are not going to be able to, be using as much coal energy. What are we going to be using in the meantime that can do it as, quickly and cheaply as that? So I think that's the other big issue that's been playing out for the government over the last 12 months. But quite honestly, the Voice has taken up an awful lot of their time. I would say far too much of their time, given the other issues that they should be dealing with.
And for context, how bad is the cost of living crisis in Australia? It's talked about a lot here in the UK. We are talking about how high inflation is, and our current Prime Minister Rishi's trying to do lots of different measures, some being successful, some not so much. But what is the impact of the cost of living crisis for, if you like, the average Australian right now in Australia?
Sure. So, I mean, energy prices is the number one issue, I guess. The cost of energy is gone like through the roof. It's up 20% or something like that. But I think the other one that people are really saying, and I see it as well, going to the supermarket and getting your trolley full of groceries, they are significantly more expensive than they were, even 12 months ago. And it's at the point where people are saying, you get the shopper docket at the end and you say, how can all of that have cost this much? So I think that's, from talking to constituents and getting the feedback on the ground, they're the two big ones that I'm hearing about, that cost of energy is through the roof, and the cost of groceries as well. And that's not to mention the fact that, we have had a lot of interest rate rises over the last 12 months. So the Reserve Bank met this week and they didn't raise interest rates for the first time in, I think, 10 months. So we've had 10 consecutive months of interest rate rises. And a lot of Australian mortgage holders would fix their mortgage rate over the COVID period. And so we know they are all going to come due within the next, I think it's in the next quarter or so. So it will be very interesting to see what impact all of those rate rises have when they all of a sudden start hitting in a few months.
Right. So again, a lot of this is very similar to the UK in terms of what's been going on with even interest rate rises and energy cost. The cost is really gone up here. I'd say it started to stabilize a bit more here than maybe in sort of other places. What's interesting is, and being when we talk about Labour here in the UK, it's always fascinating to hear what Labour is, and if you like, in different countries. Our one, I'd say, has started to move maybe a bit more to the centre. We had somebody called Jeremy Corbyn, who would be considered extremely far left, and now they've got someone called Sir Keir Starmer, who's kind of moving it more the spectrum towards the middle. But a lot of people would argue his party just having so many really far left fundamentals that there's only so much he can really move that needle. What's if you like the comparison in Australia with the current Labour, if you like, administration?
I would say it's very similar. The difference being obviously that our Labor Party is in government and yours isn't. Anthony Albanese is doing everything he can to present himself as a centrist, a middle of the road prime minister to the Australian people. He took a very small target strategy through the last election campaign back in May, beyond a broken promise about reducing everybody's power bills by $275, which they haven't talked about since the election, and The Voice. There wasn't really that much that, in terms of firm commitments that the government made during that campaign. Oh, an integrity commission. They promised an integrity commission, and they've delivered that within their first 6 months as well. But they ran a very small target strategy, not putting, really big, scary ideas to the Australian people, just putting very common sense ones. But I think the issue is, and the point you make about the Labor Party in the UK, it's the same issue here, that while you might have a leader who is doing everything he can to appear to be a centrist, we do have to remember that there are still, people within the Labor Party and within the government who have ideas way left, way left to the point where the Prime Minister is. And we're sort of seeing that play out a bit at the moment with some of the debate around the AUKUS agreement, where, we now have 3 members of the government who are basically saying, well, we don't think AUKUS is a very good idea. AUKUS is a bipartisan foreign policy and defense commitment that we should all be sticking to. And so I think it's absolutely crazy that you've got these fringe elements of the Labor Party saying that they don't think it's a good idea, and then the Prime Minister sort of still insisting that he's a government for all Australians. We do, and we in opposition, I think, have to draw attention to this fact that there are a spectrum of views in any party, but the far left of the Labor Party and the Greens, who they have to work with to get legislation through the Senate, will at some point start pushing their ideas upon the rest of the government's agenda. And we have to be very attuned to when that happens and call it out when we see it.
So, again, very, very similar to some of the stuff that we hear in the UK. Obviously, they're in opposition, so it's slightly different. And we're regularly seeing the constant conflicts within their own party. I think it's got better in the last probably 6 or so months, where they seem to have a slightly more united front. And we're going for a sort of different process in the sense of we've had a Conservative government for a considerably long period, and we've got an election coming up next year at some point. So there's lots of talk of what, if it going on polling right now, it looks as if Conservatives are going to really struggle to stay in power. Our party's gone for a lot of, if you like, turmoil the last year or so. So it's a slightly different kind of period. One of the criticisms many people have had of our party, the Conservatives, is our lack of conservatism. So a lot of people would say that in the last maybe ever since COVID, we haven't really, we turned into a big state over COVID, lockdowns, that sort of stuff, but the power necessarily hasn't fully gone away, and we're still not showing necessarily the most conservative values. Taking that into Australia with your party, the Liberal Party, do you see a more conservative element? By that, I mean a party that's generally supporting lower taxes and much more freer economy. Is that something you see within your party, the stronger conservatism maybe?
Yeah, I think the last few years have been challenging for centre-right governments across the world, right? Like, we, to an extent, had to park our values to deal with the pandemic, because, I mean, I'm not sure of all the details of exactly what the Conservatives did in the UK during COVID, but in Australia, obviously we had lockdowns in all states at one point in time, and in some states there were Liberal governments in charge, and they were locking people in their houses for extended periods of time. We provided an awful lot of income support to people who couldn't work for whatever reason during the pandemic, particularly during lockdowns, and all of that doesn't necessarily sit well with us, right? As fiscal conservatives, we don't think that government handing out money, hand over fist to the voting public is is the right way to have a strong economy or manage a central budget either. So that really did, I think, challenge all of us. And to an extent, I think, again, in centre-right parties across the world, we need to rebalance ourselves. And I don't think it's about lurching, to the political right or to the political left, but it's just about remembering the values that our party stands for and thinking carefully about how we can sort of re-articulate those values to the voting public and be very clear about what it is that we stand for. And also keep in mind that as much as we had to park our values during the pandemic, we have to be an alternative to the left of politics, right? By design, we need to have clear differentiators on a policy front and a value front with left governments or oppositions, whichever the way it might be in your local area. And we need to be proud about doing that, and we need to be brave about doing that, because goodness knows the media is not helping us anywhere at the moment, and particularly in Australia, the media is they're very enamoured with our Labor Prime Minister, and they are writing story after story about the Liberal Party's demise, and I just think that that's absolute garbage. Our values now are just as good as they were when Sir Robert Menzies first articulated them back in the 40s. We just need to be proud of those values and stand up for them.
It's the media stuff, I think, is almost universal. We have a massive issue here in terms of the push on the sort of just general woke left culture here, mainstream media for this country's, I think in most people would say, a pretty bad state in terms of what they talk about. And there's always a reoccurring joke, which is like you almost have to sign a social contract of stuff that you believe in before you can be on these news outlets. And we actually had your former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson was on our platform, and he was really explaining a lot of this. Yeah, I mean, some of the stuff we did a whole series with him and John Anderson. They talked a lot about their time in leadership and what they sort of the issues they face, and you could just see some of the stuff is so relevant to the stuff that's going on today. And John in particular spoke a lot about the difficulties as a Conservative now compared to when they were in administration, in terms of how difficult it is, and how a lot of things he would be talking about when he was in the administration wouldn't be considered as conservative. They weren't considered as anything. They were just considered as very normal things to discuss. But those same things now in Australia are seen as conservative, which is what he finds much more challenging and different. We would say that's a fair reflection in general. I know that's for sure the case here in the UK, in Australia as well. That's sort of just very difficult to almost use common sense arguments, and you're almost thrown into that batch of conservative thinking or right-wing thinking. Even you'd argue maybe 10 years ago that it was just a normal, it wasn't even a political debate.
Certainly. And one of the issues that I've championed since getting elected is the issue of women's rights, and making sure that we stand up for this idea that, again, 10 years ago wouldn't have been entirely controversial, that or controversial at all, that women should be allowed to have their own sports and their own spaces and their own facilities without a male identifying as being a woman and being able to access those spaces and those sports and those facilities. And I know all too well that if you say something like that these days, then the media will automatically categorize it as being anti-something, when in reality, what you are just doing is being point one, pro-woman, and point two, standing up for something that is absolutely 100% basic common sense. And we never should have found ourselves in this position to start with. But I see, whether it's on social media, whether it's in traditional media, women, not just myself, but other women who've stood up for these issues and fought for these issues, being, called horrible, horrible names. And that's on the good end of the spectrum, but having their motivations for standing up for those issues questioned. And I just find it frankly disgusting that's where our media in particular has come to, that when they hear a woman is an adult human female, they interpret that as something else, and it being about something that it quite frankly isn't. So yes, I think our media has a lot to answer for, and it is getting progressively harder to mount those traditional conservative argument, or traditional common sense arguments, not even conservative arguments in the public discourse.
I think that debate is definitely heating up more and more in the UK. We saw it in Scotland, where a prisoner who somebody who had committed a crime against women started identifying as a female, was a man. They put him temporarily into a female prison, and they changed their mind, and it just became it blew up over here as a topic. And I think I've been fairly vocal on this sort of stuff, which is, I think it's such a demise on women's rights. I think that's what's going on now. It's probably one of the most horrible things towards women's rights maybe in 20, 30 years. I think it's a really but you're right, because saying this sort of stuff, just saying a woman's a woman, a man's man, or whatever, that sort of stuff, you're automatically put into a transphobic kind of category and all this sort of nonsense. But is that a massive issue in Australia, the women's rights stuff? Because here in the UK, we're seeing more and more worrying stats about children being, some of the stuff that we saw. One of the studies that came out is how schools don't want parents to know about if a child is now saying that they want to identify. Is that something that's happening in Australia as well?
Definitely. So one of the reasons I got involved in this whole debate was not long after I was first elected. I started receiving a whole heap of emails from women in particular, but from mums and dads generally, concerned about a set of guidelines that Sport Australia, our nation's peak sporting body, had developed, saying that inclusion in sport should be on the basis of gender identity rather than sex. And so sport was probably the first issue that I came across where I thought, this is something that people cared very deeply about. We are a sport-loving nation. All Australians play, or many Australians play sport in one form or another. And just sort of seeing it snowball from there. And now we're, likewise having conversations about the prisons issue in particular, and a lot of this really dehumanizing language, like using expressions like chest feeders and all of this sort of really crazy stuff that I think really rubs people up the wrong way. So the debate hasn't progressed quite as far here as it has in the United Kingdom, because I know some very, very good women over there are fighting very, very big and important fights on that front. But we are seeing it more and more in Australia.
It's definitely, we for a long time here in the UK saw it as more of a American problem. That was the big thing we saw in California, how they were sort of one of the first places where they started accepting people who identify as females into their prisons, and we saw the reaction was in terms of men going in and beating women in prisons and impregnating women in prison, and then it became quite apparent this was quite a crazy idea. And then somehow in the UK we decided, or in Scotland, that this we should do something similar. Thankfully the backlash was good enough so that got reversed in Scotland. But it's becoming much bigger, and it's a good example of how something as important sport is, if it's not sort of tackled, where it can potentially go down. Because I think we're definitely seeing the repercussions now, where in terms of schools, it's going further in particular in primary schools with kids, which is the kind of more worrying side of this whole debate. In terms of the sort of like the average Australian, is this something that comes up in conversation? Because it's definitely, I would say, in the last maybe 2, 3, 4 years in the UK, this is a conversation that definitely comes up a lot more.
Oh, absolutely. And look, I am sort of known as being the politician that talks about these issues. So I do get a fair few people coming into my office and saying, "Oh, tell Senator Chandler well done for everything that she's doing," and that's really lovely when that happens, and very humbling when that happens. But so I do hear about it a lot. But I think what I've noticed over here in particular is that when, at least on the sports front, when a sporting body makes a decision around this, whether it's World FINA or World Athletics or World Rugby coming up with policies. Sorry, something's just flashed up on my screen. Coming up with policies that sensibly say that women's sport is for biological females, and that's it, and that's something that's worth protecting. So we see a conversation around it when that happens. Conversely, we also see a conversation around it when it becomes public that a male is competing in women's sport as well. So it's sort of events based still, but I would say I mean, like I say, people are more than happy to raise these concerns with me because I know that I've been standing up for them. But I mean, the other issue is as well, though, so many people feel that they can't talk about these issues publicly because they will get labelled as bigoted or worse. Just for saying them. And when I'm getting emails or messages or whatever it is from particularly women, they're all saying, thank you so much for standing up for this, because I don't feel like I can, because I'll be socially ostracized, I'll lose my job, yada yada yada. And there's just so much pressure to conform, and I just find that really troubling.
In terms of I was going to talk about the general abuse you get on a, whether it's daily basis, monthly basis. What has that been like, and did you expect to get as much as you do, or do you think it's far less than what you got? Because here in the UK, we would say people involved in politics get a lot of abuse. Is that similar experience in Australia? I mean, a lot of it is mainly social media here. I don't think you get really anything in person. Is that a similar experience for yourself in Australia?
Yeah, and look, when I first started speaking out about the sport issue in particular, I didn't expect to get anywhere near the level of pushback that I did, because perhaps naively I thought, well, this is just a common sense position. Of course, women and girls are entitled to their own sporting competitions. It's not fair or safe for expect them to do otherwise. So yes, I went into it perhaps thinking that I wouldn't cop quite the level of abuse that I have. But look, yes, mainly on social media is where it happens. And I am not on Twitter for many reasons, but number one is the fact that I just don't think it would be a good place for me to be if people were saying really horrible things about me like they say on my Facebook page. I think I found one message on my Facebook page today that had every four-letter word under the sun thrown in, directed at me, and I thought, this is bad enough on Facebook, let alone being on Twitter, where I think people are just even more careless about typing something up and hitting send and not really thinking about the impact that it has. But then I hear about women like J.K. Rowling and the level of abuse that she has received, and I think, well, fortunately that has never happened to me. I haven't had credible death threats or anything like that, but it's vicious, and I can completely understand why many women don't feel empowered to stand up for these issues because they are scared of the backlash that they will receive. And in terms of pursuing a political career, I could completely understand why any woman would look at the experience I have had, or other female colleagues of mine who have suffered for what they believe in, and think, why would anyone think that this is a vocation that is worth pursuing? Of course it is. It is, and we have to keep fighting, because we can't have a situation where women are scared of putting their views on the record and standing up for what they believe in. But it's a really challenging environment at the moment. I hope there is an overcorrection at some point in time. I hope we can find ourselves in a situation where we're able to engage in public discourse politely and considerately again. But I don't think that's going to happen while Twitter still exists as a platform for many people to enter into that debate.
It's definitely difficult. We, as an organization, myself, are quite fairly active on Twitter, and it is we always joke it is just a sewer pit of just pure abuse. It's nice to get the message out there, and for us in the UK, I'm sure the stats similar in Australia. Only around 17 to 18% of our population's actually on Twitter. So it's, it can seem like a very it can seem like that's still wild, but the harsh reality is it's not a remote accurate reflection of what's going on in our country. I'm sure it's the same in Australia and the
And
States.
I think one of the big issues with Twitter as well is that our media uses it as sort of a rolling news feed, and they get their stories from Twitter. Like if I see one more news article about something that someone tweeted or something that someone put on Instagram, I'm like, that's not news. What someone wrote on social media today isn't news. Go out and talk to some real people on the streets and figure out, what their concerns are. Don't just, think that this very strange, twisted segment of society is something that's worthy of putting your journalistic pen to paper on. There are far bigger stories out there in the real world.
I think there's also the case of the silent majority, especially with, I think, conservative voices. You're much less likely to be a vocal conservative than you are if you're on the left. They always typically tend to be a lot more vocal than we are, and they'll shout and scream about things. So it can seem like there's a lot necessarily more of them, but the reality is they're just a lot louder than I think than we typically are. I want to move to something slightly more positive in terms of talking about the UK Australia potential. I mean, it's something, again, one of the things that a lot of people have been frustrated about in the UK is the lack of engagement we've had with Australia, New Zealand, Canada in particular. We've obviously been very Europe centric for the last decade and more. And one of the exciting things with sort of global Britain plans is the potential of being closer with, in particular, those countries there. What's the view in Australia? How do they see the UK? Because we've had Australian previous people in Australian administrations, politicians, who've all said that they feel sometimes in the last decade or so often ignored by the UK, or not necessarily valued as much as they would have liked. What's the view, do you think, currently of today of Australia and the UK, if you like, potential between the two countries?
I don't know. It interests me that that's been the view that you've heard, because I think culturally, at least within, the younger generations, I think there's a really positive attitude towards the United Kingdom. I mean, many, many, many Australians will go backpacking or have their gap year, or want to go to the UK at some point to work, because it's a wonderful country, similar values, part of the Commonwealth, yada, yada. Like it just makes sense. There are also many Australians that have ancestry from that part of the world as well. So I certainly think, I think there's a really good, strong relationship there that we should be leveraging. And I haven't seen anything to make me think otherwise.
I think where we got it from is more sort of ministers saying that, we could do more. Like, it's not that the two countries should be doing more together and building on that relationship. In the past, we've not really done a lot as two significant countries in terms of whether it's trade deals, whether it's helping each other with sort of better migration between two countries. That sort of feel in terms of there's a lot more potential amongst the countries than we've probably realized. I
mean, we're obviously pursuing a free trade agreement now, which is a very positive step forward, but not something that was necessarily able to happen before Brexit. So I think that's a really important step.
And I think we can sort of rounding things off in terms of if we can give a sort of positive message on the Liberal Party and what its future looks like, what you think the difference they can make, if you like, currently with the Labour Party, and how you guys kind of, if you like, reclaim it and come back and take the next administration, would be great to hear. And then also just some of the things that you think that Australia as a country, its sort of potential, where so for us, for example, a massive thing that we're talking a lot about is expanding even more our service-based industry. We call it the gig economy, where we've quite become more and more tech data focused. Where do you see the future of both your party and Australia as a country in general?
Well, in sort of keeping with the theme of what we were talking about right at the start, when the Liberals find ourselves in opposition almost wall to wall, as we do now, it is more important than ever that we hold governments to account. And, you know, it sounds so simple, right? Everyone says, well, that's what the opposition is meant to do. They're meant to hold the government to account. But I think that means, you know, we really do have to, you know, dig behind all of the spin from Labor governments, and we see an awful lot of that, particularly at a state level. In states like Victoria, we need to cut away all of that spin and very carefully and concisely look at what these Labor governments are, you know, ostensibly trying to deliver to Australians, and see whether or not what they're saying they're doing actually measures up with what they're doing on the ground. So it's a really important period of time for all of us as Liberals, I think, to engage really deeply with our communities, to understand the issues that are making them tick, like the cost of living issue, and, you know, the shopper docket that's looking, you know, out of control now versus 12 or 18 months ago. And it's hard to do that having gone through the pandemic, and the way in which we engage with constituents was, or, you know, not just, politicians engaging with constituents, but, you know, everyday people engaging in everyday society with each other. That changed so much. And we, you know, almost have to wind back the years a bit, I think, and say, well, how do we do this? How do we reach out to people in a post-pandemic era? How do we understand the issues that are making people tick? Because if we're not doing that work, if we're not reaching out into our communities and understanding what the issues are, then we're not going to be able to hold governments to account, because we're not going to know where the problems are. And the other reason I think it's important for us to be reaching out into our communities and engaging with people on a, you know, a face-to-face basis wherever possible is it goes back to that value piece. Our values are very good values. They're very sound values. They've served not only our party, but broader society very well for, you know, in the Liberal Party's case, the last almost 80 years, I think. And we need to be connecting with people and showing them how our values can be used to solve the problems that they see in their life. And so I guess that's the next piece for us as oppositions. It's hold government to account, and recenter ourselves on our values, and then be able to demonstrate that if there is a deficiency in what the government is doing, here is how our values could be used to improve that deficiency better than what the government's doing themselves.
I think that's so important. One of the big criticisms of our current opposition Labour is they do not hold even us Conservatives nowhere near to the accountability that we as Conservatives would like to see. It's so important for democracy, for it to really flourish. You need credible opposition in this country. You could argue for a long time we've not really had that, and that's how complacency creeps in. That's how the country suffers in a lot of ways. So it's great to hear that the Liberal Party and yourself have these plans to really hold the current administration to accountability.
And then in terms of the broader piece around what next for Australia, and what will be happening for us in the future, again, I think there's this adjustment sort of post-pandemic, right? We realized very, very quickly during the pandemic that we need to be able to make our own stuff, so that if we are in a situation where we can't source it from elsewhere, that we have some sort of sovereign manufacturing capability there. And I think some of the public attention has perhaps slipped on that issue in recent times, just as, you know, the borders have reopened and we've all started moving around a little bit more, but that risk is still there. And particularly looking at the geopolitical situation in the region, we need to be ready to, you know, to be more self-reliant when the next big disruptive event comes. It's probably not going to be another 1 in 100 year pandemic. hopefully. But, it might be conflict in our region, and we need to be ready for, what that might mean for us. I mean, generally in a defence capability as well, but, in terms of our everyday lives, how we would deal with that, how are we going to get fuel, how are we going to get the goods into our country that we currently import that we may not be able to if, our access is blocked off or something like that. So some really big challenges into the future, and that, with challenge always comes opportunity, but we have to be ready for them. Again, I'm not confident that our current government is necessarily ready for those challenges. So we as Liberals are going to have to stand up and call that out when we see it.
Great. Well, it's been great to have you on today, and yeah, best of luck for the future, and keep us updated on your journey within the Liberal Party.
Thanks very much, Sunil.